Hello and welcome to the History with Jackson podcast. This episode of History of Jackson was sponsored by the Bean Around Coffee. Bean Around Coffee is based in Peterborough and they sell and make some amazing coffee. You can head to their website to buy some coffee beans or some coffee grounds. Now they make some fantastic coffee and it is my favourite coffee in the country. And for you want to grab yourself some coffee, head to www.thebeanaround.com and use the discount code HWJ and the bear 10 for 10% off all your purchases. I'll leave the discount code and the website in the description below. Hello everyone, I hope you're all okay. Today we are joined by Astrid and Chinny from the amazing It's a Continent podcast. And today we're going to look at the importance of Black history, Black British history, and the Bristol Bus Boycott of 1963. So how are we both doing?
Good. Excited to have this conversation, and thank you for having us.
Thank you very much for having us.
No, thank you very much for coming on. I really appreciate it. And sometimes I think it's important to speak about these issues that have definitely been, I've noticed in my own schooling and educational career as a teacher and student, that we don't often touch upon Black British history enough. And when we do, it's all about the slave trade. So I think it's important to look at these positive parts of history. And I think it leads me to this first question, actually. How did you both initially get interested in Black British history?
I think it kind of the starting point, like you said, in terms of like schooling. So for me, I grew up in Devon. So I moved to the UK when I was 7, grew up in Devon, and my only other kind of like Black friends were my siblings. So in terms of connection with Black history, Black British history, there was very little, to be honest, none. And so the older I got, and I was like, I actually have this massive gap. I'm great when it comes to British history, but my own history, I have no idea. And you also start thinking about, were there any Black Brits? And so it was through that you were like, through history, because it's something that we don't really explore or get told about. And so through that, I decided, we just explored further, did my own learning. And that's how we kind of, It's a Continent and this whole, podcast and book came about, really.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think there's always been a focus on like African American history when it comes to Black History Month. And I think I was in like, so where do Black people in the UK come in? Like, because we've been here for quite a while. So I guess it's like the curiosity kind of drove me to have a look and do my own research. And because information is much more accessible than it was whilst I was in school, I think it's become more easy to kind of get that information that we kind of share with our audiences today.
And it's fantastic how you both began that journey as historians through wanting to learn more and research more. I think that's really, really great, actually, that you've both gone out there and found this information for yourself. Now, why is it important to learn about Black British history then?
I think in order to understand the way that the UK is in its current form, we need to understand all forms of history that have taken place. And I think, unfortunately, we tend to separate Black history and have Black history and then British history, or just history. But actually, the two of them have much more of an interlink and should be discussed as a whole. So when we do discuss Black British history, it should sort of be part of the wider discussion. And I think a lot of people didn't know about the Windrush, because we had the Windrush scandal, which is still ongoing, until that news story broke, which is quite a disservice, because we then didn't understand how on earth, that situation occurred, because we didn't know what had happened in the past with the Windrush arrivals and everything like that. So it kind of helps us to understand the point of where we're at in this country and how, there is still racism, discrimination against other sort of groups that are living within the country. And it's because of the history. And it's kind of, you have to understand history to kind of understand the present day.
Definitely. And I think to add to that, it helps from a representation perspective as well, because you do realize, British history, Black people were involved and we did support within that space. And I think it's really important to make sure that Black voices and the contributions that were made are amplified as well, especially kind of, Black History Month. For me, that's what the purpose of it is really highlighting, like, this is also our contribution within the country.
That's a fantastic point. Like, not to, or to focus on those who have possibly been erased from history. I think it's really important that, a lot of history has been whitewashed, and the contributions of people from minority groups from all across the world has been diminished. So is that kind of the meaning and importance of Black History Month then?
Yeah, it's a way of sort of highlighting the contributions that Black people have made to the wider world. Unfortunately, we do get the stories, the stories of enslavement, which has dominated the narrative, which, these stories are important. We need to learn about this to understand, again, how we got to the current position in the world today. But at the same time, we do also need to celebrate the achievements of Black people. And unfortunately, that is kind of, it's not covered as much, and particularly that of the UK, and what we'll discuss today with the Bristol Bus Boycott, because that was a movement that actually saw change. And I think when we think about, civil rights movements and activism, we always look to the US, but there have been many other sort of political movements that have been spearheaded and should be sort of recognised and celebrated.
Now, when we've been talking about, we need to understand the past, understand the present, and sometimes we need to look at the whole context, look at the historical moment. When we're about to look at the Bristol Bus Boycott of 1963, what was Britain's relationship with Black people historically, and in particular up to the 1960s?
I think a key part of that, stemming from the Berlin Conference, where you had, all of these kind of like Western countries, so like Britain, Germany, coming together and splitting up the African continent. And then from that, you then had, Britain's kind of footprint within Africa and also the Caribbean as well. And so I think that relationship was very much the starting point, and kind of up to kind of the 60s, and actually slightly past that for some countries, because the 60s was very much where we saw a lot of African nations start gaining independence. It was very much Britain kind of making the most of having its own colonies within Africa, essentially. And so, yeah, that was obviously a really dark kind of period. And obviously you had the British Empire. So all of those were very much the relationship that Black people had with Britain.
Yeah, definitely. We also saw these attitudes extended to Caribbean countries, because they also did not receive their independence until around the same time period. So we had this attitude that lingered kind of post colonization, where there was still a lot of discrimination at the time.
And it's like, a lot of people don't look back and think, oh, the British Empire, and think of all the negatives that the empire kind of perpetrated against its own citizens or its enslaved people. And I think it's really important to draw light to those subjects and those moments. Now we're gonna be looking at Bristol specifically, and I think it's really important to explore Bristol's relationship with Black people at this time, because Bristol, in recent memory as well, has been an important city for some protest movements. So what was Bristol's relationship with Black people before and up to the 1960s?
Yeah, so the main sort of Bristol is a port city, so it was heavily involved within the transatlantic slave trade. So we had 500,000 enslaved Africans transported using ships from Bristol, and Bristolian merchants actually making a lot of money from the trading of enslaved people to go on and build, beautiful architecture that we see in Bristol today, such as monuments and cathedrals and museums, like really imposing buildings. And as you mentioned, around the protests recently, Edward Colston, his statue was famously pulled down in 2020. I believe it's now in a museum. And I think it's a shame, because if I'm honest, I didn't know who Edward Colston was until that incident took place, which is quite, again, we had the argument around, oh, but the statue will educate and say what, but the statue wasn't.
No one's stopping by.
The statue did not educate. It didn't educate anyone. So I think that legacy kind of has lingered, because without the transatlantic slave trade, there's no way that Bristol would be the city that it is today. So it was processing tobacco and sugar, the raw materials, that were picked within plantations, and then that's what generated the money for the city.
And I think the whole like Edward Colston's piece really highlights a key element when it comes to British history in terms of romanticizing the past. Because I think there is definitely a balance, but sometimes it tends to lean very much into this sort of like saviorism and having an empire that was wonderful, but actually that darker element creates a lot more fairness in terms of really identifying, okay, there were challenges and being much more open and honest about it. Yeah.
One thing I would add is that I did go to Bristol last year, and during that visit to the museums, it did have a lot of sort of statements talking about kind of the legacy of empire and enslavement within the city. So it did say, is this museum funded by enslaved people? It did actually admit to that and said, yes, it is. And it is, I think there is now a bit of progress being done with sort of sharing these uncomfortable truths.
And I think that's definitely somewhere where, as you've mentioned, that museum in Bristol started to do quite well, that Britain as a whole needs to start catching up and acknowledge its past and the involvement in its past and its present. Because if we don't acknowledge these things, if we don't come to face them, we won't educate our future generations. Now, speaking about being funded, we're moving on to the 1960s, and politically and economically, it was a difficult period for some people. But how were Black people and other minority ethnic backgrounds being affected by political and the economic situation at the time? Were they more harshly affected than white people in Britain?
Yeah, definitely. So we had the Windrush generation who came over from the Caribbean countries, and actually a lot of the people on board that came over did actually fight alongside Britain during the Second World War. But there was already a little bit of hesitation at this point, because we had people that were mass immigration. And I guess it's sort of the first time that this kind of entered political discourse. So you had the Prime Minister at the time, Clement Attlee, being quite surprised at the number of people arriving. But actually, Jamaicans, for example, had every right because of the British Nationality Act, which meant that people could move across, like proper freedom of movement across all of the British Empire, which was just huge at the time. But the people that came over ended up living in like bomb damaged or poorer areas. So we know like Brixton in London, or Notting Hill at the time, it used to be quite a slum area. But is because these were kind of the only areas where Black people could actually rent or even buy, if they were really lucky, property at the time. So we did have a lot of anti-immigration rhetoric kind of entering the political discourse. So we've got a quote from John Hind, who actually described people coming in as pouring into the country. So that's when we start to see that language kind of enter. And then you did also have a lot of discrimination as well, and a colour bar, which we all know kind of happened and restricted people of colour, including people coming over from India or Pakistan or other sort of countries, which prevented them from actually getting jobs that they wanted or housing as well.
It's really interesting that whole like anti-immigration rhetoric was coming through, because especially at the time, Britain needed people to come through and support when it comes to the NHS and that sort of thing. So it's really interesting that they're like, obviously, enabled it through policy that people had the freedom of movement, and they also required those people to come in and do the work and support the things like the NHS. But at the same time, we're really being negative about it also. Yeah. So it's like, feel free to come in, but you're also not very welcome here. Yeah. So it's just, the double standard of it is so frustrating, because like these people made such a massive contribution, fought alongside Brits as well, but actually it was like, well, actually this is the box that we place you in, and we're only happy for you guys to belong in this very specific area. But it's really difficult to swallow that. It's just
I think so, and because a lot of like this country's identity does ride on World War II, if we're honest, and to not even sort of acknowledge the people that did actually help that effort, and say, oh, actually, no, these people, like, they were part of the empire. They helped us succeed in this conflict. But they, because of that sort of racism, and the way that the British Empire was, in that the subjects were kind of lesser than. I think that's what's kind of fueled that attitude that we see.
And it must have been very difficult for these people coming across. We're having the positive message of come to Britain, come and experience Britain. And then you get there and it's not welcoming at all. It's not what those initial messages were, which I can understand would be a very difficult thing to face and confront.
Yeah, it would,
and especially considering that, you know, the Windrush scandal is only recently really come to light, and to have come to Britain in the 60s, having lived through like decades, and it's only until this point that we're now really recognizing the challenges that these communities face coming into Britain is honestly heartbreaking. And I do think, just obviously it's the reason why we're having this conversation, but just needs to be amplified, because the representation isn't there, and kind of the recognition of how difficult it must have been to have been, like, you know, as I was saying, one hand, yes, it's open, you're free to come in, but actually you're facing barrier upon barrier for you, that you're not able to kind of live here freely.
Yeah, and you can't even, like, you know, pubs actually did have some form of segregation at the time as well, because I think it's easy to think around when we hear the word segregation, that we think of apartheid, or we might think of the States, but actually there were sort of informal, it wasn't necessarily written in law, but these attitudes persisted within just society in general.
And talking about these colour bars and this segregation, you know, what events occurred then in the lead up to the boycott?
So there was a lot of racial discrimination that people were facing, and I think for me, I sort of see the Bristol bus boycott as like a kind of melting pot in terms of all of that kind of amplifying, because essentially what you had, the Bristol Omnibus Company, they were a bus operator at the time, and essentially, as you mentioned, they had a colour bar in place. And so essentially it meant that if you were, you know, Black or Asian, you weren't allowed to work for the bus operator. And so it kind of meant they weren't able to gain employment because of the color of their skin. And also those who were in work, who are kind of white British, also supported this sort of like discriminatory kind of practice. So yeah, it was very challenging to kind of, a really challenging time to kind of even gain employment for a lot of people.
And the treatment that these men are experiencing with the Bristol Omnibus Company, then, is that a typical experience that Black men at the time were experiencing, or was it something that was just happening within Bristol?
So there was, I'd say, a little bit more relaxed rules when it came to Transport for London. However, there was a colour bar in Euston Station, if I remember correctly. So it wasn't unusual to have these kind of practices in place. So at the time, it seemed like the norm, because this was prior to the Race Relations Act. So actually, discrimination was not illegal. So an employer could just say, you know, actually, or, you know, someone could come for an interview, saw that they were Black or Asian, and said, actually, it's filled. Like, that was quite common. And the same goes for housing as well.
And so we've looked at the treatment of Black men, and we've looked at the events occurring. What actually occurred with this? I know it's kind of in the title, bus boycott,
Yeah.
but what actually happened with this event then?
So the local bus service essentially passed a motion to ban people of colour from working as bus conductors and drivers in 1955. And as we said, because the unions had at the time supported this practice, they didn't really do anything about it. And then the local newspaper then sort of revealed this racist policy in the early 60s, but the boss of the Bristol Omnibus company defended this and said that, you know, his staff didn't actually want to work with people of colour because they made the excuse of, oh, actually, you know, the quality won't be good, or it's unsuitable for white bus conductresses to work with Black male drivers, and the local council ended up backing this sort of racist policy. we did have at the same time some people opposing this motion. So we had Black men, Owen Henry, Roy Hackett, who recently passed away, Audley Evans, and Prince Brown. And these men were part of what was known as the West Indian Development Council. And they were formed kind of out of that Windrush generation. And they joined force with a man called Paul Stevenson, who became a spokesperson for this group. So what happened was that Guy Bailey was a Black man that was put forward for a position at the Bristol Omnibus Company, who they accepted, but when they realised that he was a black man, they kind of rescinded the offer, basically. So he called on, the four men and Paul Stevenson to kind of call for a bus boycott in 1963. And they did get a bit of support from students and tutors from the University of Bristol. So a demonstration was also staged at the same time. But the bus workers who supported the colour bar were heckled as well. So yeah, there was a claim, because I know I mentioned earlier that Transport for London was slightly more relaxed. So the bus, the company sort of head claimed that non-white people that worked for Transport for London would kind of end up displacing white work. So again, there's that fear of, the whole migrants coming and taking our jobs trope. Again, we kind of see this surfacing as far back as the 60s.
And to see those messages reoccurring, decade after decade, kind of shows that we haven't confronted this at all.
We never learn our lessons.
No, never.
And honestly, it is so kind of, it's just sad to see, because a lot of the messagings and the words that were being used is stuff that we hear today and we see in certain political campaigns, and kind of how it's reiterated and controlling our borders. So it's really difficult to see, because when you see just the contribution that these communities had made into Britain and the way they've been treated is,
and it's also the fact that this is not mentioned. Like, we all know about Rosa Parks, but we don't really know much about this story at all, which again is a bit of a disservice, because then we'd be able to learn and see, okay, this is why how Britain's gotten to this current point.
Well, now you've mentioned Rosa Parks with her bus boycott as well, I wanted to ask, what's the significance of bus boycotts then?
I guess in a sense it's like collective action, because for Black people fighting for civil rights movements in America, and also those in the UK trying to gain employment rights, they just had to sort of withhold something, and it was then by not getting it on the bus, or by collective action, demonstrations, and it did actually change policy towards the end. So it's something that I think when there's not much power, then the collective action is really important, and this is an example of that happening and working.
And when we're talking, you've touched on policy there and changing to policy, and you've also mentioned that the university in Bristol were supportive of this movement. How did the national media and national politicians, how did they react and view this boycott? Because obviously it's gone from a small Bristol problem to prominence, or being a prominent event in the national consciousness. What were those reactions?
You also had, from a parliament perspective, MPs supporting the boycott, and I think that really helped to really amplify and highlight what was going on in the situation. It was also as a result of the boycott that Race Relations Act in 1965 and then in 1968 were introduced to really then say, okay, we really need to make sure that, in terms of racial discrimination, this is something that we need to look into. And so the act itself that was introduced banned racial discrimination when it comes on the grounds of kind of color, race, or ethnic or national origin. So I think it really helped the newspapers at the time helped to amplify it. And I think because it was resonating with people, and then MPs also bringing it to light, really helped to push for change, really.
And was there much of I know around this time we have Enoch Powell, not a very pleasant man, if I'm, and that's probably a nice way of saying it. Not a very, very pleasant man in British history. You know, he is very prominent at this time. You know, what was his kind of reaction to these kind of issues that were in Britain at this point?
Yeah, whilst they were sort of rolling out the Race Relations Act, I think that's when he kind of then piped up with his with his rivers of blood speech, and that emboldened and allowed for groups like the National Front to terrorize people of color within Britain, just I would say for maybe 10-20 years at least, even probably into the 90s. And the scary thing is that a lot of them are still around because it's all very recent. A lot of people would have probably, marched with the National Front, done the demonstrations. We've seen sort of more modern interpretations of that with, the EDL, unsavory figures like Tommy Robinson, for example. And that's kind of the legacy of the National Front, Enoch Powell emboldening these people and sort of peddling these assumptions about people coming from other countries into Britain, despite the fact that they were invited and they were at the time, citizens of the United Kingdom and its colonies. That's what it was known as at the time. So yeah, it really kind of started this really nasty discourse around immigration.
And that speech is a very, very chilling speech. It's not a nice speech to listen to in any way, shape, or form. And the fact that has come as a negative reaction to a very, very positive, needed piece of legislation shows the far-reaching positive and negative outcomes from this situation. Now, obviously, this event not only stirred the nation's consciousness, it also had international kind of effects. What was the international reaction then to the Bristol Bus Boycott?
So the High Commissioner for Trinidad and Tobago and a famous cricketer of the time, Sir Constantine, did write to the Bristol Omnibus Company. And I think that kind of would have had direct influence because at the time, during the 60s, that sort of thing happening abroad and people talking about it from a global perspective, it means that it was a big story for that to happen. So his influence was also kind of instrumental in applying pressure to the relevant figures and allowing for the Race Relations Act to happen.
And that, like you said, it's a big thing for these, especially in the 60s, where information doesn't flow as easily as it does today. For something like this to become a global event and for international actors to get involved, it really does show the gravity of the situation. So we've looked at the Race Relations Act. How much change, apart from this act, does this boycott bring to the UK, and how does it affect the lives of Black people living in the UK?
So the act itself was very much a starting point because Britain started kind of seeing itself and saying, we do have a racial discrimination problem. So you had the first act, and then after that, it sort of grew into looking at discrimination from an employment perspective, housing, certain ads. And so it was very much this, I see it very much as the starting point really for Britain to look at itself and say, we need to look at discrimination a lot more and make sure that we're also protecting all these other communities as well. And so, it was extremely critical part of British story.
Yeah, and on the other hand, unfortunately, we have mentioned Enoch Powell, but these kind of the events did kind of lead to the opposite side being galvanized by some, because then it's like the enemy, and they're upset that this has happened, and we also see within the sort of freedom of movement that sort of winding down. So by the time we reach the late 60s, the Commonwealth Immigrants Act comes in, which means that they say that only belonging people have the right to work in Britain. But according to their rules, belonging meant that you had to prove a connection to Britain through either a parent or a grandparent, which would mean that if you'd come from an African country or a country in the Caribbean, then you may not have a way of doing that. So that was just kind of a coded form, or a euphemism for basically saying white. And, Australians or New Zealand or Canada, you might be able to prove that a bit more easily at the time. And the 70s did end up being quite a dangerous time for Black and Asian communities. So it wasn't unusual for people to be assaulted or, walking home or kind of getting racial abuse quite openly. And then by the time we do get to the early 70s, we then have the Immigration Act, which then stops large-scale immigration from Commonwealth countries. And we do then again see the discourse around immigration entering political discussions, because Margaret Thatcher then starts using some of the language used by far right groups, by describing Britain as rather swamped by people with a different culture, which is quite a popular clip that often goes round. And she did end up winning the general election the following year. So that kind of resonated with people. It's a bit like the take back control kind of line. Some things just never change. And then by the time Thatcher then comes into power by the time we get to the early 80s, there's now the British Nationality Act, which means that a Commonwealth citizen who comes to Britain has to register to become a British citizen, which means that freedom of movement across empire then kind of stops. And I think that also means that you can't, if you're born in the UK, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're a British citizen either. So that's where it starts to get a little bit more not as accommodating towards those who were once invited or once subjects of the British Empire.
It's interesting to see for one thing that led to positive outcome for a group of people and a change for their life, how it so negatively went the following decade, and Britain, the changing political establishment from quite a liberal perspective at that point to one that swung to the right is, well, whilst not directly stemming from this, it seems to be quite a sad change from so much growth and liberalism.
Yeah, it's like people are sometimes afraid of change. And I think that when we see change happening and we then start to see, some people might have then seen peers that they might have thought in their heads that they were superior to them, or that they were once people that lived in former colonies. And then when that person then becomes your peer, they may then, that kind of, it doesn't sit well with them. So that could be not advocating for behavior. I'm just trying to understand.
No, I think it's definitely, because if you think around the 60s, a lot of African nations were also gaining their independence, right? And so there's this sense of like, well, how I've interpreted it for me is like, maybe for Britain, allowing that sort of freedom of movement initially was for them to sort of still maintain a level of control and relationship. And then it kind of got with them that, okay, by doing so, we are saying that they are equal, and then actually the reality of that maybe wasn't what, they'd expected it to be. And actually then it's like, oh, how do we then withdraw a little bit? And then it was about creating these barriers. But at the same time, just think from a messaging perspective, Black and Asian people who came through made such a huge and positive contribution to British history, but it just gets completely decimated by
it's a very difficult thing to have to look at and go, look, this is, well, not difficult, but difficult part to look at and then encounter and say, this is what happened. We need to be aware of our own history. We need to be aware of the negative connotations that were pushed out, and the negative treatment that people received on the hands of white governments across the world, not just in Britain as well. Because, whilst this is about Black British history, the same treatment happened across the world, really.
Exactly.
Now, talking about the rest of the world, I do have a final fun question for you both. You two have recently written a book, and if anyone's seen on the History of Jackson blog, I've written a review for It's a Continent, Unraveling Africa's History, One Country at a Time. Now, this is truly a fantastic book. What was your favourite part of writing this book?
I'd say just getting to learn. Like, we started the podcast because we was like, there's a gap in our knowledge and understanding, and we wanted to learn even more. And then it kind of grew into this book. And I think having the opportunity to just learn even more and being able to share that with people, because, if you're looking at, understanding and learning more about African history, there's a lot of content. So it was nice to kind of support people in having that starting point and something that we felt was lacking. And so, yeah, for me, it was that, just having the opportunity to spend some time and learn even more.
Yeah, I would agree. I think just when we do our podcast, we often sort of find out information on the go. So then we're like, oh, and that's like the reaction. So it's almost the same with the book as we were writing it, because we just find out things, for example, about Lucifer in Africa. Like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that Black people living in Portuguese-speaking African countries had a curfew at 9 p.m. Like, it's just, how did I not know? You just think that this is just ridiculous, like these kind of things that we've discovered. So yeah, and it's the excitement about wanting to share that knowledge with others, for sure.
And I definitely sense both your personalities coming through in the writing. I could hear you two from the podcast. So I found it such a great book. I found it really funny. So I think in parts, not in the serious parts, obviously.
We toe the line.
Yes. But I think one of my favorite parts, and I think for any historian, it's really great to see a book where chapter by chapter, I mean, it's not like a university reading list, but it kind of is, where it's going, have a look at these ones as well, which I thought was really helpful from a perspective of someone who might want to learn more about African history.
Yeah, for sure.
And for us, that was like deliberate, because we were like, well, if you wanted a starting point and didn't know where to even begin, you could pick this up, select, decide to do, okay, West Africa, learn, and then go and dig deeper. Because I think for us, we didn't want to be an encyclopedia, or, there's just no way of covering absolutely everything. And there's definitely an element, as we said earlier, around, the history that we've learned in school. There is definitely a deficit when it comes to covering Africa's history. And so for us, it was, you do have to do your homework, which is what we've got out there and done. But
it helps you with some of
people,
it.
we'll give a little bit of a starting point, just a little bit, and then you can carry on and share that with people. And I think we built a really nice, if I say so, like community through the podcast that people do share. And, if they find some more interesting facts, share it with us. And I think that's kind of how we've seen it and set it up.
Yeah, definitely.
And you guys have been on the go constantly since you published that. So I am in awe of your energy since it's been. Now, if people want to go out and learn more about the Bristol boycott, where can they look?
So there are quite a few. The Bristol Museum has a really good website where it's quite interactive, and you can find out more information around the events that took place, as well as the wider sort of legacy that Bristol has and how it got to its current position. And yeah, they don't mince their words, so it's really, really, really insightful. And I think particularly in light of the events of summer 2020, and highlighting more of an awareness and wanting to bring Black history back to the sort of well, not back because it never was, but to bring Black history to people's attention, then yeah, definitely highly recommend just looking up the Bristol Museum's website.
I think to add to that, David Olusoga's book, Black and British, he does a really nice coverage, and he does cover the Bristol Bus Boycott. So yeah, if you want to learn more about Black people in Britain, that's a good book recommendation.
And if you're in Bristol, try and go to M-Shed. It's really, really insightful.
Oh, fantastic. And I will to Astrid and Chinny's own horn as well, of saying they've written a fantastic article in the upcoming edition of the Historians magazine. It's really easy to read, it's accessible, it's packed full of information as well. So I will recommend you guys going ahead and reading that as well. And if anyone would like a discount code, use Jackson10 to get 10% off on that one. But I thoroughly recommend reading Astrid and Chinny's article. I think it's absolutely fantastic, and it was a base part of my questioning for this episode with them. So I thoroughly recommend that one. Now, everyone's going to want to find you two online, where can they find you?
Yes, so they can find us on Instagram at It's a Continent Pod and on Twitter at It's a Continent. And we also have a website, itsacontinent.com.
And fantastic. And if they want to go and find your book, where can they head?
If you go on the website, it will direct you to your,
your retailer of choice.
Retailer of choice. Just in case you don't like certain ones. So
yeah, we don't like to say certain ones in case people get offended.
Just feel free on the website.
Yeah, I'm not having that struck off. Well,
but yeah, major retailers.
Well, thank you very much, you two. You've been absolutely fantastic. I've really enjoyed having you on the podcast. So thank you.
Thank you, Jackson. Thanks for having us on.